The overhead bin slammed shut with a hollow thunk, making a few heads turn. It wasn't unusual noise for boarding time, but the tone was different. Sharp, almost aggressive. In row 1A, Daniel Brooks was sliding his leather satchel neatly under the seat in front of him. The smell of new leather mixed with the faint tang of aviation fuel drifting in from the still open door. His movements were precise, habit from a life where nothing was left sloppy. He didn't see the man until he heard the voice. No, 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 no. This can't be right. It wasn't loud at first, but there was something in the way it was said, a confidence that assumed everyone nearby would share the opinion. Daniel looked up. Standing in the aisle was a man in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive navy blazer over a pale pink dress shirt. Gold watch, cufflinks, a little too much cologne. The man's eyes darted to the seat number above Daniel, then back to the flight attendant. His voice sharpened. "Miss, there's been a mistake. That seat can't be his." A ripple went through the cabin. Heads turned. Someone paused mid-luggage shove to watch. Daniel blinked once, slow, but said nothing. He just met the man's stare with a level, unreadable gaze. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing between them. "Sir, his boarding pass says—" "You're not listening," the man interrupted. His voice was louder now. "I'm saying this isn't safe. He doesn't belong up here. I'm not comfortable sitting near—" He didn't finish. Not because he chose to stop, but because Daniel, still seated, slowly reached into his suit jacket. It was a deliberate movement. No rush, no panic. Just the slow, assured precision of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. A couple of phones came up, recording. The flight attendant took half a step back. And then, Daniel's hand emerged holding a slim black wallet. He flicked it open in one smooth motion. Inside, gleaming under the harsh cabin lights, was a gold badge, and beside it, a photo ID. The man in the blazer stopped mid-breath. His confident stance deflated almost visibly. "Special Agent Daniel Brooks," Daniel said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Daniel Brooks had never been a man who sought attention. Even now, in the front row of a nearly full flight, he sat quietly, shoulders squared but relaxed, eyes scanning without obviously scanning. It was a habit he couldn't turn off, no matter how hard he tried. 12 years in the FBI had trained him to read a room the way other people read a menu, quickly, comprehensively, and without drawing notice. Today's room was a Boeing 737's first-class cabin, 8 wide leather seats arranged in 2 rows of 4. The lighting was just a touch too warm, the faint hum of the air vents masking the occasional thump of luggage being shoved into overhead bins. Daniel wasn't here for a case. No informants to meet, no suspects to tail. He was going to Dallas to see his niece, Mia, graduate from high school. She'd been texting him for weeks, begging him not to skip it this year like he had the last 2 because of work emergencies. He'd promised her, sworn to her, that nothing would keep him away this time. So here he was, in a dark navy suit tailored to perfection, a crisp white shirt, and a burgundy tie his sister had given him last Christmas. He rarely flew first class, but his sister had insisted on covering the upgrade as a gift. "You work too hard to sit cramped with your knees in your chest," she'd said. 2 rows back, Thomas Whitfield was already watching him. Thomas was a man who thought the world owed him recognition. He was tall, an inch over 6 feet, with a frame that suggested he still played squash twice a week at his private club. His hair was carefully styled, flecked with distinguished gray. His cufflinks caught the light every time he moved his hands, which was often. He was a corporate attorney for a major oil firm, and he traveled enough to feel a certain ownership over first class. To him, the cabin was an unspoken sanctuary, a place for the right kind of people to be insulated from the chaos of coach. And in his mind, Daniel did not look like the right kind of people. It wasn't just that Daniel was young, early 30s maybe. It wasn't even that he was dressed better than most men Thomas knew. No, it was the deeper bias Thomas would never admit to himself. The one that instantly questioned why a black man was seated in the very front row of first class, looking like he belonged there without question. Thomas had already decided there must be some mistake, or worse, some deception. The cabin crew was led by senior flight attendant Claire Johnson, a woman in her early 40s with neatly tied-back auburn hair and the calm efficiency of someone who'd worked 1,000 flights. She'd seen her share of entitled passengers, but she could already tell Thomas had a particular energy, the kind that made you brace for an incident. Claire's two younger colleagues, Jenna and Mark, were busy helping passengers in the back, leaving her to handle the front rows. She noticed Daniel early on, not because he stood out, but because he didn't. He blended into his seat like someone who had nothing to prove. The boarding process moved in fits and starts. People squeezed down the aisle, backpacks knocking elbows, overhead bins filling up. Daniel kept to himself. He checked his phone once. A message from Mia popped up. Mia, Uncle D, you better be here Friday. I got the seat for you in the front row of the gym. You'll see me first. He smiled faintly and texted back, Daniel. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Thomas, meanwhile, was growing restless. He kept glancing up from his phone to watch Daniel. At first, it was idle curiosity. Then it became fixation. By the time his own carry-on was stowed, he'd convinced himself that Daniel's ticket was some sort of fluke, or worse, that Daniel had slipped past security. When the boarding line paused, Thomas leaned forward, his voice dripping with casual intrusion. Headed to Dallas too? Daniel looked up from his phone. Yeah. Business or pleasure? Family. Thomas nodded slowly, as if processing a coded answer. Ah, gotcha. But the slight smirk on his lips made it clear. He thought he'd figured something out. That was the seed, and it wouldn't take long for it to grow into something much uglier. Boarding was nearly done. The final handful of passengers shuffled down the aisle, dodging elbows and dangling tote bags. Daniel kept his posture relaxed, but his eyes moved just enough to clock details. Rows, exits, passengers with oversized bags, a nervous teenager in a hoodie gripping his skateboard too tightly. It was habit, not paranoia. In his line of work, situational awareness was as natural as breathing. Thomas, however, was restless. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward in little bursts, like a predator creeping closer to prey. He called out to Claire in a low but insistent voice. Excuse me, could you check something for me? Claire approached, clipboard tucked under her arm. Yes, sir? He gestured vaguely toward Daniel with a flick of his fingers, like one might point out a leaky faucet. That gentleman there, are you certain he's meant to be in this section? Claire's brows drew together. Sir, his boarding pass was scanned at the gate. He's in the right seat. Thomas smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Right, I just, travel a lot and sometimes people slip in. Happened to me once on an international flight. Guy pretended to be in business class. Whole thing was... Sir, Claire cut in, her voice still polite but firmer, I can assure you our system doesn't make those mistakes often. But Thomas wasn't done. He leaned back, letting out a small laugh meant for the man seated beside him, a stranger, who responded with the tight, polite smile of someone trying to avoid involvement. 5 minutes later, Thomas tried again. This time it wasn't quiet. As the last overhead bin slammed shut, he called out, loud enough for several rows to hear, Miss, I'm sorry, but I'm still not comfortable here. Claire, now visibly irritated, stepped up again. What seems to be the problem? Thomas tilted his head toward Daniel. I don't know this man. I've never seen him before, but I'm not convinced he's supposed to be up here. And frankly, with everything you see in the news these days... His voice trailed off, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. Several passengers froze. A woman in 1C clutched her tote bag a little closer. Two young men across the aisle glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. Phones began to appear, held low, camera lenses peeking out. Daniel hadn't moved. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his face unreadable. Claire tried once more, her tone clipped. "Sir, this passenger has a valid ticket. I can see his name on my manifest. There's no issue here." But Thomas pushed harder. "You think there's no issue? Look, I'm just trying to keep everyone safe. That's my right, isn't it? To raise a concern?" Now his voice had that particular sharpness, half indignation, half self-righteousness, that turns an uncomfortable moment into a scene. Daniel finally moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward Thomas. His eyes locked on him, not glaring but steady enough to make most people look away. "Are you saying," Daniel asked quietly, "that you think I don't belong here?" The hush that followed was electric. Thomas, emboldened by the attention, leaned forward. "I'm saying I have a right to ask questions when something feels off." Daniel's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Feels off to you, huh?" Claire stepped between them. "All right, that's enough. Sir, please take your seat. We need to prepare for takeoff." But the damage was done. The energy in the cabin had shifted. Every passenger in earshot could feel it, tight, tense, ready to tip over. And Thomas had no idea he was seconds away from the moment that would knock the smug certainty out of him like a punch to the gut. The air in the first-class cabin felt heavier now, as if the recycled oxygen had picked up the static of human tension. Claire stood rooted between the two men, her posture caught between diplomacy and command. She'd dealt with drunk passengers, entitled passengers, even violent ones. But this had a different flavor. This was the slow-burn kind of conflict that didn't shout. It poisoned. Thomas leaned back in his seat, but not in surrender. It was the posture of someone who believed they'd already won. He gestured toward Daniel with an open palm, like he was presenting Exhibit A to a jury. "All I'm saying is, when you've flown as much as I have, you know the signs. People who don't look like they're supposed to be here." A few passengers exchanged incredulous looks. Others kept their eyes down, pretending not to hear, even though every ear in the cabin was tuned in. The hum of the engines seemed quieter now, like the plane itself was listening. Daniel still hadn't moved much. He just sat there, back straight, his hands resting calmly on his thighs. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't about him being questioned. He was used to that in his line of work. This was about the assumption, the public humiliation, the way Thomas had weaponized the moment to turn an entire cabin into an audience. He inhaled slowly through his nose, then let it out, eyes still locked on Thomas. "You've made a lot of assumptions today," Daniel said softly. "Mind if I clear a few things up?" Thomas smirked. "By all means." Daniel reached for his jacket. The movement was measured, deliberate, slow enough that every eye in the vicinity followed his hand. Even Claire instinctively stepped back half a pace. The leather creaked faintly as his fingers slid inside the inner breast pocket. Thomas's smirk widened. He thought he'd rattled the man enough to make him fumble for an excuse, maybe a crumpled boarding pass, maybe even a fake. But when Daniel's hand came out, it wasn't holding a ticket. It was holding a slim, black leather bifold wallet. With a flick of his thumb, it snapped open. The sound, sharp, final, cut through the hush like a gunshot in a canyon. Inside, catching the light from the overhead fixtures, was a gold badge. The words around the rim gleamed in clean, precise letters. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Beside it, in clear view, was his photo ID. Special Agent Daniel Brooks. The reaction was instant. A woman in 1C let out a small gasp. One of the young men filming whispered, "Oh, shht," under his breath. Claire's eyebrows shot up so high they almost touched her hairline. And Thomas. Thomas froze. His smirk collapsed in an instant, replaced by a look that flickered between confusion, disbelief, and a creeping, cold embarrassment. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You've made multiple false accusations against a federal officer," he said evenly, "in front of witnesses." He let the words hang there, just long enough for the weight of them to land. "That's not just rude, Mr. Whitfield, that's a crime." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Phones were up now, no one even pretending to hide them. The camera lenses caught every twitch of Thomas's face as the color drained from it. His mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time since he'd boarded, Thomas looked small. Daniel snapped the wallet closed with the same crisp finality with which he'd opened it. He slid it back into his jacket, adjusted his tie, and looked away, dismissing Thomas without another word. Claire cleared her throat. "Sir," she said to Thomas, "I think it's best if we all focus on having a peaceful flight from here on." Thomas nodded quickly, eyes darting anywhere but toward Daniel. The balance of power in the cabin had shifted so completely that it was almost dizzying. The engines roared to life, but inside the cabin, the hum of conversation was hushed, cautious. What had just happened wasn't something you could casually shrug off. Claire moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts with more force than usual, her expression tight but professional. When she passed Daniel, her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. It wasn't an apology exactly, more like an acknowledgement. A thank you for handling the moment without letting it spiral. Thomas sat rigid, shoulders pulled in, hands folded in his lap. His earlier self-assurance had evaporated. Now, he avoided eye contact with everyone, especially the passengers who had been recording. He knew the footage would likely find its way online, and deep down, he knew exactly how it would look. Daniel, for his part, didn't seem triumphant. If anything, he looked calm, focused on something beyond the plane, beyond the humiliation he'd just shut down. He didn't need to gloat. His badge had done the talking, and more importantly, the truth had been seen by everyone who mattered in that moment. He adjusted his seat, pulled out his phone, and saw a text from his sister. "Sis, you on the plane yet?" Daniel smiled faintly and typed back. "Daniel. Yeah. Everything's fine. See you soon." As the plane taxied down the runway, a quiet murmur started in the row behind him. The two young men who'd been filming whispered to each other, replaying the footage. "Dude," one of them said under his breath. "The look on that guy's face when he saw the badge? Priceless." The other grinned. "Yeah, that's going viral. No way it doesn't." By the time the plane was in the air, the moment had already become a kind of folklore among the passengers in first class. The woman in 1C leaned toward her seatmate and whispered, "That man was FBI. I knew he looked too calm for all that nonsense." Some passengers smiled at Daniel when they passed him to use the lavatory. Others avoided meeting his eyes, still processing what they'd witnessed. Thomas stayed quiet the entire flight. He didn't order a drink. He didn't make small talk. He simply stared out the window, the reflection of his own flushed face in the glass. When they landed in Dallas, Daniel was the last to stand. Not because he was avoiding anyone, but because he'd learned long ago that leaving in a rush was for people desperate to get away. He was in no rush. As he stepped into the aisle, Claire touched his arm lightly. "Agent Brooks, thank you," she said in a low voice. He nodded once. "Take care of yourself." Outside the terminal, the warm Texas air hit him like a wall. His phone buzzed again, a news alert this time. Someone had already uploaded the video. The headline was short and sharp. "Passenger tries to get black man removed from first class, then sees his FBI badge." Daniel stared at it for a moment, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't interested in online fame. For him, the win wasn't the viral moment. It was that, for one flight at least, the truth had been impossible to ignore. Weeks later, the clip would rack up millions of views, sparking debates about bias, dignity, and how calm confidence can diffuse even the ugliest confrontations. And for those who'd been in that cabin, the story became a personal piece of history. They'd tell friends, family, strangers at dinner parties. I was there the day a man tried to put someone in his place and found out he was the one out of place. The arrivals hall was a mix of chaos and reunion. Rolling suitcases clattering over tile, the sharp hiss of espresso machines from the coffee kiosk, kids breaking into runs toward waiting relatives. Daniel walked at an even pace, his carry-on rolling silently beside him. The badge was back in his jacket pocket, but the weight of it felt different now. Not heavier, just present. From behind, he could hear Thomas's hurried footsteps. Daniel didn't turn. He didn't need to. People who avoid eye contact after a public defeat always walk a little faster, shoulders hunched, head angled just enough to pretend they're invisible. Sure enough, Thomas veered toward the ride-share pickup lane without a word, disappearing into the crowd like a man desperate to outrun a shadow. Near the baggage claim, a woman in her late 30s approached Daniel hesitantly. Excuse me? She said, her voice low. Daniel paused, offering a polite smile. Yes? She glanced around as if to make sure no one else was listening. I was in seat 2D. I just wanted to say, thank you. For not... She broke off, searching for the right words. For not making it uglier than it already was. You handled that with, I don't know, grace. Daniel nodded once. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay calm. Her lips curved into a small smile. Well, it worked. I think you changed a few minds today. Outside, the Texas sun hit like an open oven door. Heat shimmered off the asphalt, making the air dance above the taxi lane. Daniel spotted his sister's SUV idling near the curb. Mia was already leaning half out the passenger window, waving both arms. Uncle D, over here! When he reached the car, she practically launched herself at him, wrapping him in a hug that almost knocked the carry-on out of his hand. You made it, she said, beaming. I told my friends you'd be here. Now you have to meet them. But I also told them you were in the FBI, so you have to tell some cool stories. Daniel chuckled. Maybe one or two. As they pulled away from the terminal, his sister glanced at him in the rearview mirror. You okay? You look, I don't know, thoughtful. He hesitated. Just had an interesting flight. That night, in his hotel room, Daniel's phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It wasn't even a text. It was a notification from a news app. Viral video. Passenger confronted in first class turns out to be FBI agent. 1.2 million views in 6 hours. The thumbnail image was unmistakable. His badge, held steady in his hand, gleaming under the plane's cabin lights. Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew there would be comments, some supportive, some toxic. He also knew he wouldn't read them. Because tomorrow, he had something better to do. Tomorrow, he'd be sitting in the front row of a high school gymnasium, watching Mia walk across a stage, diploma in hand, face lit with the pride of someone who knows she belongs exactly where she is. And in that moment, he realized that was the real badge, the one no one could question. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. News anchors were playing it between political headlines and weather updates. Morning talk shows debated it over coffee mugs. The title varied depending on who posted it. Racist passenger picks wrong guy. He tried to get him kicked off, then saw the badge. Calm, cool, and FBI. Hashtags trended. Badge check, #fly with respect, #agent Brooks. In one split-screen segment, a legal analyst broke it down frame by frame. Here you can see the suspect, the accuser, leaning forward to make his case. But watch Agent Brooks' body language. No raised voice, no aggressive posture, and then, bam, the badge, textbook de-escalation. Thomas Whitfield, meanwhile, was not enjoying his 15 minutes. Someone had tagged his LinkedIn profile in the video's comments. Within hours, his company issued a vague public statement about respect and inclusion that didn't mention his name, but didn't have to. By day 3, Thomas had locked down his social media accounts. A blurry photo of him in the terminal, head down, shoulders hunched, began circulating with the caption, "Man who thought he was in control." Daniel's FBI supervisors called him in, not to reprimand him, but to say, "Nice work, Brooks. You didn't just protect yourself, you made the Bureau look damn good." Daniel shrugged. "I wasn't trying to make a point." The assistant director smiled. "Sometimes the point makes itself." Back in Dallas, Daniel walked Mia to her graduation ceremony. On the way, she scrolled her phone, gasping. "Uncle D, this is you. You're famous." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Famous isn't the goal. Doing what's right is." Mia grinned. "Yeah, but it's still pretty cool." And somewhere in the endless churn of online content, the clip kept playing. Viewed by strangers in airports, coffee shops, and living rooms across the country. For some, it was just a viral video. For others, it was proof that dignity could disarm prejudice, that calm could be stronger than shouting, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And for everyone who'd been on that flight, it was a story they'd tell for years. "I was there the day a man tried to put someone in his place and found out he was the one out of place."